King. Spend $6 or more at any BK and receive your scratch card. There are more cash prizes than ever, including instant win prizes of $25 and $50, thousands of food prizes, and even e-scooters and karaoke machines to be won. Scratch and win big with Burger King today. Terms and conditions apply. Full details on burgerking.ky.
Well, Doc, I'm getting old. I'm out of shape, always on edge and off balance.
And how does it make you feel?
I guess it makes me feel like I should live better.
Here's my suggestion.
Are you saying I'm a blank piece of paper?
Turn it over.
Live well? Is this code?
No. Live Well from Foster's and CG Britk. A great resource on staying healthy, decluttering your mind, and managing stress.
Really? And it's free?
Really. LiveWell.Fosters.ky won't cost you a cent. This session, however, live well with Foster's and CG Britk.
You are listening to Radio Cayman, the voice of the Cayman Islands.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky. At the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, helping people plan for retirement is at the heart of what we do. To help improve our member experience, we would like to receive feedback from our members and employers. Send us your feedback on the overall experience and suggestions for improvements by email at pensions@chamberpension.ky or by calling 743-9125 or 745-9130. We are committed to improving member experience, which helps you make more informed decisions that lead to better pension saving outcomes. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We are here for you.
Live from Radio Cayman Studio, this is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
Good morning and welcome to Money Sense, brought to you by the CFA Society of the Cayman Islands. I'm your host, Amy Hubble. So I'm joined today by Anu Bradford. Good morning, Anu.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And I'm going to read an abbreviated version of her bio. She is very, very accomplished, of course. But Anu is a professor at Columbia Law School and a leading authority on the EU, the digital economy, governance of AI, and global economic regulation, especially antitrust. Her newest book, Digital Empires, explores the global battle between the superpowers of the US, China, and the EU. So that's, I think, where we need to start, is those superpowers of the US and China and the EU. What is the state of the world when it comes to those superpowers today?
So I would say that the state of the world right now is not exactly reassuring. So we are dealing with geopolitical tensions, military conflicts, where these key players are very much involved. So we obviously have a war in Europe, the largest attack on a European country since Second World War, when Russia invaded Ukraine. That is very much challenging the European security order. The United States is aligned with the EU in delivering arms to Ukraine, looking to defend their global rule-based order. Then we have a war in the Middle East, another shocking challenge with just tremendous humanitarian suffering and a loss of life. And that's also where in the US is very active in trying to help Israel in the conflict, but at the same time there's collective need to mitigate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So that's obviously a challenge. And then we have the superpower conflict between the US and China, the increasing geopolitical tensions where the two are really battling for technological supremacy, economic, geopolitical, ideological, military power. And that is obviously a challenge for the rest of the world, including the EU, how to navigate the conflict between the US and China.
Especially coming out of COVID, even right before COVID, I felt like we were on a path to globalization, and especially from an economic perspective, where, as of course you and I would agree, that globalization is best for economic output being maximized. So how did this happen coming out of COVID, that we've suddenly created these, just enemies on all sides, it seems like?
Yeah, so I think we need to go back a little bit, that there's been already before COVID a growing sense that economic globalization hasn't served everybody well. So there's been a keen sense of the losers and the winners, and the losers' resentment, blaming globalization for the declining quality of life in many wealthy societies within those societies. And that has then led to this backlash to globalization. Then we had the COVID, and there was this further deterioration of our trust in global supply chains, and the sense that we needed to be more self-sufficient, a move away from globalization. And then we had sort of the growing tensions between the US and China, where the US felt that China was not playing fairly, that China was undermining our common understanding how to create prosperity across the borders, how to trade without manipulating currencies, subsidizing your companies, and engaging in commercial espionage to secure an unfair commercial advantage. So there were growing tensions. China felt that the US was just trying to sort of topple China's ambitions, contain the idea that somebody else could be the leading economic hegemon. So that led to an escalating trade war between the two that now has a very much, I think its edge is this technological rivalry between the US and China. That is moving us again further and further away from that integrated global economic order. So we see much more of a pursuit of technological sovereignty and sort of self-sufficiency. We see export controls and investment restrictions and massive subsidies as these countries are trying to shore up their domestic supplies and production, while then restricting, for instance, the US restricting China's access to the critical technologies.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a little bit of a loaded question, but how much of that do you perceive, at least from our standpoint, it's almost neutral parties, of some of that being real and some of that being political talking points in terms of, is China trying to steal our information? Is China trying to steal our people? You know, we've been talking about China becoming the global superpower for decades, it feels like. But that hasn't happened. Why? And what level, I guess, of realistic power is there?
I think it's hard to know exactly. So I think we certainly have seen a tremendous rise of Chinese influence, political influence, economic influence, and an economic growth where China is a very different player today than what it used to be. And we've seen significant technological progress. We've seen the build-up of military, so some of that certainly is real. But then we don't fully know the relationship between the Chinese companies and the Chinese government.
There's a lot of loss of trust there in terms of can we trust the numbers that they're publishing?
Absolutely. It is very difficult to know, and if Chinese company TikTok, whose parent is a Chinese company, says that, look, we would never hand out the American users' data if asked to do that by Chinese government. Nobody in the US believes that is the case, that they can credibly commit to protecting the American data. We, at the same time, don't exactly know what would happen. What is the relationship between TikTok and its parent company and its relationship to the Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah, and that's obviously been a big thing this week, especially, I think, obviously the House in the U.S. voting to ban TikTok, whatever that means, ban TikTok. I'm not even sure they know what it means when they're voting. And then you see, a former Treasury Secretary coming out and say that they're going to try and put together an investment group to buy it, which somebody that just, especially from I don't use TikTok, but it seems like somebody that is very far removed from that kind of age group that does use TikTok trying to acquire it, I don't know is great. And then China, of course, coming back and saying, no, we're not going to sell this under any circumstances.
Absolutely. I think this is fascinating to watch. So first of all, the US has traditionally taken the view that we should not be intervening in the digital economy, very committed to free speech. And now suddenly they want to take away the platform that many Americans are using as their venue for free speech and engagement and exchange of information. So this is a very contested one. If you look at how many TikTok users are now very upset with the legislators with this ban. But at the same,
it's supposed to be just fun. Right? You're taking away something that people enjoy, whereas the almost secret threat or the fear that's being kind of pushed is that it's not necessarily the videos that you're posting, but that they can get access to your phone and your location and anything else that you look at or see.
And look, there is a potentially serious concern, and the concern over TikTok is twofold. So one is the idea that the Chinese can manipulate the algorithm so that it becomes a propaganda machine and reach basically American youth with the Chinese curated content. And the second is the other one, that the Chinese are using that as a way to then harness American data that can be then used in a ways that is particularly valuable for the Chinese Communist Party. So there's also the data breaches. But I think this is now, it's an interesting thing whether the ban is feasible. So first of all, it would need to be approved in the Senate. It would need to be signed into law by President Biden. It would need to withstand any legal challenge before US courts, which is another hurdle. And then, as you mentioned, this is not an easy sell. This is a very valuable company. There are only so many potential buyers. So you imagine one of the leading US tech giants actually having the money to buy it. But how could you then get an antitrust clearance? We already worried about the market power of Meta. So do we now want to add to the repertoire of Facebook and Instagram, TikTok? So that is not going to go through as a deal. So I think this is going to be, and what you mentioned, absolutely agree. The Chinese government is probably going to prevent that sale under Chinese law, which puts TikTok into this limbo that they need to choose the market. They either need to retreat from the US, which is very expensive for them. This has become, they've been tremendously successful on this market. Or then they would need to go against the wishes of the Chinese Communist Party. And I don't know exactly how they're going to go about that.
But I mean, I think TikTok is a perfect use case for everything that we're talking about, right? It's something that, everybody, our listeners, even if they don't use it themselves, they know in their mind what that means and kind of can tie it. What other kind of practical use cases, especially when we talk about AI? AI is just like this sometimes nebulous thing that we talk about. And I think we understand digital surveillance. I think we understand the fight for data. I think we understand the value of data. But when we talk about AI specifically, what do we think that means when we're talking about that war that's happening?
Yeah, so I think some of the most controversial questions about governing AI relate to surveillance. So that is when we talk about facial recognition being a very powerful technology, and it is used. The Chinese are building a lot of surveillance technologies that the cities and states are buying, and they can be very effective. We talk about safe cities, smart cities. You can automate traffic control, energy use. You can use it for legitimate law enforcement purposes, locate missing children. I think nobody would think that that is a bad societal goal. But at the same time, you build this surveillance architecture that can then be used by the national security apparatus in the way that undermines your civil liberties. And the world is turning more authoritarian, and authoritarians now have a very powerful way to crack down on dissent and entrench the existing hold of the society. So I think that is one example. The other one is that we're already dealing with a lot of disinformation.
Sure.
And AI can amplify the generation.
Especially in an election year.
Absolutely. The 2024 is the biggest year for democratic elections. We have half the world population going on polls this year. We have presidential elections in the US, European Parliament, we have the UK, we have Mexico, India, Indonesia. These are big elections. And we already have this challenge that we have disinformation that is distorting the voters' ability to make judgments. Now we have the deep fakes where AI is producing videos and audio and totally distorting our sense of reality. And it's very hard to exercise your free will and in that setting and make choices when you don't even know what the candidates are saying or are not saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to need to pause there for just a second and take a quick break, but I want to come back to exactly that point in terms of what those use cases can be that can benefit society, as well as some of those issues with the upcoming elections. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
At the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, helping people plan for retirement is at the heart of what we do. To help improve our member experience, we would like to receive feedback from our members and employers. Send us your feedback on the overall experience and suggestions for improvements by email at pensions@chamberpension.ky or by calling 743-9125 or 745-9130. We are committed to improving member experience, which helps you make more informed decisions that lead to better pension saving outcomes. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We are here for you.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
All right, we are back with Anu Bradford. Welcome back, Anu. Right before the break, we were discussing about the use cases of AI when it comes to especially political actions just because of the time that we're in this year. You mentioned that half of the world is going to be undergoing an election this year, and really what that could mean. Now, at least in the US, which of course we're very close to, and I think we're probably all most aware of who the likely candidates are going to be, at least from the American public, we already know both of the candidates. So how big of a role could AI realistically play in that?
So I think AI can play a tremendously significant role. So we are particularly worried about AI distorting the will of the voters and actually engineering elections, changing the outcomes. So you can use AI to micro-target certain voters in your advertising. And you can use AI then to automate messages that are not real, that are amplifying the already compounding issues around disinformation. And I think AI is just something that takes it to the next level. If you think about this idea that you are starting to overlay on just a normal tweet to very persuasive audio, video, where we already had an incident whereby President Biden was basically subject to this deep fake, whereby he apparently made a radio address asking the voters in the New Hampshire primary behave in a certain way. And that wasn't him, but the voice was very real. So now we have these tools, and these tools are very widely available. It doesn't take a lot of talent, a lot of skill, a lot of time, a lot of money to create these videos. And I think that is particularly harmful. And I think that is the big fear, because even if we then were able to debunk some of these videos, it can be very close. If it's released 24 hours before an election, you don't have the time to rebut this. And still you have some people who keep wondering, well, maybe it was real, or who don't see these attempts to rebut these false videos. But it also happens the other way around, that we have truthful messages that are very important for voters to hear. So candidate says something that would really give users the pause. And now the candidate can dismiss that and say, that was AI generated deep fake. It wasn't me, it wasn't real. So I think that's one way how in the election context in particular, I am deeply worried. So look, there's a conversation of harms of AI, and I have a very hard time estimating what is the likelihood of these catastrophic existential risks, like AI is obliterating
it's
humanity.
Not just the US, of course.
Yes, and these are really big ones, but what I can say already, that this is here, this is real, this is likely, it will happen. So the way AI can really undermine our democracy in the context of disinformation distributed as part of elections.
Yeah, well, back to that point of being worried, let's touch on Trump just briefly. And specifically, let's bring it back in terms of that global context that we've been talking about. Because of course we know that Trump is a very vocal, he's going to pick fights with people. He doesn't even need deep fakes. He is going to come right out. He is very inciting of things. And historically, at least, has been almost complimentary of President Putin, has certainly rallied his support base around, very anti-China. What does that mean in terms of should we have another Trump presidency when it comes to specifically that U.S.-China trade war and what that could mean for an escalation? I mean, not only of the trade war, which is a little bit nebulous to understand, but specifically security risks, military risks.
Yeah, so I think what is important to note is that even though President Trump initiated the trade and tech war, President Biden has kind of doubled down and has also taken a very harsh view on China. So both parties are very hawkish on China. So right now you get no political points for being soft on China. And I think there we see a sort of continuity in many ways. But I think what happens under Trump presidency is that everything just becomes more erratic and uncertain. So even if there was a general commitment to be tough on China, we don't know the manifestations. It's very hard for companies affected by this, export controls or investment restrictions, to know exactly what is coming, how they are implemented, what the strategic plan of the administration is. And I think that makes it very difficult domestically for US players, but also then internationally, that it is just, he is unpredictable. And he may think X today and Y tomorrow. And it's just one tweet away from a policy shift that makes it very difficult to manage already very consequential and tense geopolitical tensions. And I think that is the big difference. Not as much that there's a very different philosophy in today's world about the US-China relations. And then comes the question of sort of national security challenges and the treatment of allies, that if there is a sort of military escalation around Taiwan. So President Xi has expressed his intent and willingness to unite Taiwan with the mainland. If that triggers a military response in the US most likely would want to get allies involved.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about nuclear powers here.
Absolutely. So this is high stakes conflict. But then President Trump has sent signals to its allies in the NATO to say that NATO may not be committed to defend Europe if there's a sort of escalation of the war moving on from Ukraine to other European powers, that the NATO security guarantees wouldn't be there. But somehow would America then expect other allies to also get involved in this conflict? So this is a very, very difficult situation to then assess how any national security escalation would be handled.
Of course.
Under President Trump.
Well, let's shift a little bit and talk about what countries could benefit from this, right? I mean, we've talked about all these threats. We've talked about, obviously, a lot of almost bad news. But what about Russia almost aside, but what about the Japans of the world? What about the Saudi Arabians? What about the UAE, where we're seeing, India even, where we're still seeing a lot of growth there, a lot of capital being generated? Even the EU, which we've talked very little about, and which is, of course, your specialty. How do those countries in this, almost two-power benefit here? How do they get in there? How do they almost catch up with the AI revolution?
Yeah. So it is very interesting. There have been some countries that have benefited. Malaysia would be an example, when companies are now starting to hedge and diversify away from China. There's only one China, so it's very hard to move all that production out of China, but they are looking, Apple is building more in India, but at the same time you see semiconductor manufacturing, some of that moved to Malaysia. So there are some regional winners in places like Vietnam, Malaysia, that are potential manufacturing hubs.
And pardon my absolute ignorance on this, but would Malaysia and Vietnam be neutral parties in those?
Well, they would take the business that is now moving away from China, and that's in many ways they just welcome the investment from the global manufacturers, from multinationals. They certainly keep their market open. But I think there are many, like Europe is often portrayed as being forced to choose between the US and China. And I think Europeans...
Yeah, that's the situation. Will everyone in the world be forced to choose?
I think the Europeans have made it very clear that they are not choosing. They have really been striving for greater technological sovereignty. They talk about strategic autonomy. And it is a very good slogan, but again, thinking about becoming totally sovereign when it comes to sort of national security capabilities, when Europe has been free riding on American security for a long time. So it is harder to actually implement. But I think that is clear intention. India has been playing off the different players, I think, in a pretty savvy way. So it has some alliances with democracies. India is considered to be still the world's biggest democracy. It has collaborated with the Europeans and Americans. It certainly is not friendly to China, but at the same time, it has very close ties to Russia. It continues to buy Russian energy, and hence directly undermining the sanctioning regime of the US and the EU there. And India is also, I would say, sort of retreating from its commitment to democracy under Modi in significant ways. So it's not exactly a reliable partner, but it certainly is navigating the conflict without saying that I'm choosing to totally side with the US policies.
Absolutely.
It's siding with the US when it suits its interests, But then there are many other countries that are more at the mercy of this tech war. It depends who are their political alliances, where their economic opportunities are, what are their connections to these different markets, whether they can actually afford not to go along when the US asks them to do something, or when China is providing the critical infrastructures for them.
How long do we think this period of just these two superpowers fighting lasts? Is there any historical precedents that we can kind of look back to in the past that we can say, this period of time looks a little bit like this, that could somehow inform our future?
Look, it's very, very interesting. So obvious comparison is often drawn to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, but this is of a very different nature. So if you think about even just the economic entanglements, China is so interwoven into global economy that decoupling truly from China, it's very different than doing that. The Soviet sphere was very separate in many ways from the sphere of influence of the capitalist world that sided with the US. But here we have a lot more countries that are going to straddle in between autocracy and democracy, and that are not fully picking their sides. So I think the spheres of influence are more blurred in this particular case. Well, ultimately, I think all empires fall at some point of history.
Is the age of capitalism over? That's what we need to know.
Yeah, and I really think that what we have seen in China, that it's kind of this communist capitalism that they have been pursuing as their philosophy. I mean, it has served them pretty well, but China's economy faces many headwinds. And the question is whether they are leaning even more heavily now to that communist part, that control part, and whether the economy can thrive under increasingly strict state control. But also I think the US is rethinking its capitalist model, that there is a backlash to this market-driven ideas. There's a
There's
lot
certainly
more.
some feeling in population within talking to people that I think that there is a large part in the US that looks at the European model, for example, with healthcare and with some of those things that do really benefit as the US population continues to be more diverse, that I think we would like to see some of those things. But then of course that's created the polarizing piece there.
Absolutely. But there is a kind of rethink underway in the US as well, what the future of the country is, what its economic future, its political future. And some of those commitments, like commitment to free speech, is very deeply held, which is why issues like we talked about the TikTok ban, it goes against the very ethos of America, the same way that there is still an understanding that free markets have created tremendous prosperity. But there's now increasing conversation around the sort of distribution of that wealth, and whether there needs to be a rethink in the commitment of sort of greater social protections and more equal opportunities and distribution of the benefits of digital transformation. So in many ways, I think we are in an inflection point as societies and as well, that there's just too much tension for this to last forever in a sustainable way. At some point, it just blows up, and it's already, I think, led to just, I think, tremendous challenges. It has led to wars, and it has led to the kind of superpower tensions that are really now coloring all the interactions.
Even a year from now, the world could look completely different in terms of who we consider to be friendly and who's not.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, we have come to the end. I want to ask one more question specifically around Cayman. Cayman is traditionally served as a neutral place for the world to, I'll say, store its capital. And that, I think all of this tension really puts Cayman somewhat at risk, but also an opportunity there, in that it would be absolutely crucial, at least from my perspective, that we would maintain neutrality. And it's not that we have a military power. Obviously, we have very close ties to the US and the UK. But I think that the neutrality for us is very, very important. But what do you think in terms of Cayman's ability to prosper under either winning scenario?
Yeah, so in many ways, I think Cayman is in an ideal place. When the empires are fighting, you don't want to be at the center of all that. You want to be a little bit removed to a place that seems to still offer more stability and prosperity. But at the same time, your sort of financial industry is so tied to the United States. You cannot really say that we don't care about the dominance of the dollar.
No, of course.
Yes,
Exactly.
and the US can weaponize the interdependencies that have been built in the global economy. And it has shown its willingness to do that. So it has really, if you look at many of these export controls, it has now extended that to secondary sanctions. It has used what is known as a foreign product rule. So it's not only refusing to export certain products, including strategic technologies, to places like China and Russia, but it is expecting any third party that incorporates any US technology to basically implement those same restrictions. And now we move into the frontier of investments.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because sanctions has been at the front of the Russian conflict, because we control a lot of those global structures and a lot of that global capital, because it is all sightist here, and we have been asked to freeze these assets.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Exactly right. It is hard to maintain neutrality in these cases.
And the US is increasingly turning its attention to financial flows, including to China, to say that we cannot be realizing how much foreign capital is fueling Chinese innovation. And if that innovation is then leveraged against the US security interest, the US needs to stop the flow of that capital, which means it doesn't only stop the flow from the US, but any of the ones that are connected to the US system. So in that sense, I don't think it's going to be a smooth ride when you can just say that, okay, we are neutral, we have nothing to do with this conflict. Unfortunately, I think that is going to be pretty sort of stormy waters to navigate in the years ahead.
Very fair, and I think we could probably do a whole nother show on the dominance of the US dollar and those things, but unfortunately we have run out of time. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this talk. As a final note, we will be back in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much for tuning in to Money Sense.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky. At the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, helping people plan for retirement is at the heart of what we do. To help improve our member experience, we would like to receive feedback from our members and employers. Send us your feedback on the overall experience and suggestions for improvements by email at pensions@chamberpension.ky or by calling 743-9125 or 745-9130. We are committed to improving member experience, which helps you make more informed decisions that lead to better pension saving outcomes. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We are here for you.
And of course, that was Money Sense Radio Cayman Time Check 8:01. This time check brought to you by our friends at Foster's.
Well, Doc, I'm getting old. I'm out of shape, always on edge and off balance.
And how does it make you feel?
I guess it